Hello, I'm going to kick off the event. Thank you for joining us today for the first ever virtual Sustainability Month event organized for and by campuses across the California State University system. I'm Holly Fajak, the Sustainability Coordinator from California State University Long Beach, and it's my honor to welcome you all and introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali. The first speaker in our two-part series, Climate Justice Equals Social Justice, Conversations Exploring the Intersections of People, Planet, and Power. Although I can't see your smiling faces, I'm excited to know that based on our Eventbrite registrations, that we have students, faculty, staff, and community members from 60 educational institutions joining us today, including many from all 23 of our CSU campuses. Before I pass it over to Dr. Ali, I want to share a few other announcements with all of you. First, if you haven't already, I want to encourage you to register for the second event in this series taking place on October 14th, a conversation with intersectional environmentalist Green Girl Leah Thomas and Indigenous climate activist Shuteska Martinez that will be moderated by Chico State University's Associated Student President Bree Holbert. Our goals for both of these events are to inspire and empower our students and community members, to introduce them to leaders who are making social and racial justice central to the work they do to protect the environment and reverse climate change by engaging frontline communities and developing the necessary solutions. You're here today, so we know that you must care about these issues too, and we know you won't want to miss this great event. So please sign up by using the registration link that we're going to be putting in the chat. I also want to take a brief moment to recognize the committee who organized these virtual events. Our committee was made up of sustainability officers from the 11 CSU campuses shown here. It has been a great pleasure working with all of you, and I want to thank you all for your hard work. The series was also made possible because of the support and generosity of so many partners across the CSU system, and we want to thank each and every one of them for their generous contributions. Before I pass the virtual mic over to Dr. Ali, I want to first welcome Mr. Chris Devers, an elder from the Palma Band of Luiseno Indians and a former chairman of the band's tribal council. Elder Devers will share some words of acknowledgement of the lands upon which our CSU campuses sit.
Thank you, Holly, and good afternoon to all those that have joined the call. And it's an honor to be asked to just say a few words. And I hope you take the words seriously from wherever you are at here in California. And I understand Dr. Ali's on the East Coast, but also our brothers and sisters of the islands. You know, Mother Earth is small enough to realize now that we are all connected in some form or fashion. And we also have to understand that, you know, Mother Earth doesn't belong to us. We belong to Mother Earth. And as Native people, it is our duty to try to sustain Mother Earth. You know, we realize that she provides for us mostly all of our needs. And for our tribal groups in the great state of California, wherever you're at, whether you're in Long Beach, Los Angeles, San Francisco, take a moment to realize, you know, centuries ago, who were the first people that their footprints are below your homes, your schools, everything that we have today. And try to understand the role that they played in managing the resource that was around them. Mother Earth provided for them, gave them the tools to manage the resources, to understand the cycles of life in regards to the seasons. Taught them how to not overburden any of the resources, to manage those resources. We would have never thought that in this day today that the temperatures and the climate change and the social distancing that we are envisioning would ever happen. You know, I had the opportunity to somewhat be raised by our tribal elders. And that was the 2 generations before me. And the knowledge that they passed on the importance on everything that we do not only affects us today, but in fact affects the generations to come. So, just wanted to pass those words along to you, Holly, and the staff that put this together. Thank you for, giving me a few moments to do so. And I look forward to, if it's okay, listening to what Dr. Ali has to say. It sounds like it may be interesting. So thank you.
Thank you, Elder Devers, for those words. And yes, by all means, please stay with us and join us for this talk. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, just a couple of additional housekeeping notes. If you have tech issues, please enter the message in the chat, and the host will do our best to resolve any issues. If you submit something in the chat, please be aware that only hosts will be able to see it. Students, if you're attending this talk for course credit or extra credit, please use the link in the chat to sign in to the event and provide your professor and course details. And after Dr. Ali's remarks, we'll be taking questions. So please use the Q&A function on Zoom to input your questions, and we promise we'll try to get to as many of those as we can in the time allotted. And now it's my great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali. Dr. Ali is a renowned thought leader, international speaker, policymaker, community liaison, trainer, and facilitator. He currently serves as the Vice President of Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization for the National Wildlife Federation, and is also the founder and CEO of Revitalization Strategies. Before joining the National Wildlife Federation, Dr. Ali was Senior Vice President for the Hip Hop Caucus, a national nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that connects the hip hop community to the civic process to build power and create positive change. As the Hip Hop Caucus Senior Vice President, he led the strategic direction, expansion, and operation of its portfolio on climate, environmental justice, and community revitalization. Prior to joining the Hip Hop Caucus, Dr. Ali worked for 24 years at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. He began working on social justice issues at the age of 16 and joined the EPA as a student, becoming a founding member of the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice. During his more than 2 decades at the EPA, he worked to strengthen environmental justice policies, programs, and initiatives. And now, without further ado, we welcome Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you, Elder Devers, for that land acknowledgement. I would also like to just pay honor to the Mattapanai and the Pamunkey, whose land I currently am standing on. And thank you for the sacrifices of all those so that we might be here in this moment. I know we only have a short amount of time together today, and we have a lot to unpack. Talking about power and people and the climate and how all of that comes together and how we can actually make real change happen. And the question is, what is our vision? What is our vision for both this moment and also our vision for the future? And for us to really understand how we find ourselves in the situation that we are and how we can also move forward in a very positive, transformative direction, we should understand how we got here. And for those of you all who follow me, and I know some folks hit me up on social media to say that they were going to join us today, you all know I only give real talk, because real talk is necessary because it grounds us in the facts. It grounds us in what our history has been, but it also allows us to create a new set of opportunities moving forward. And if we're going to have real talk today, we have to understand the way that systemic racism has played a role in where we find ourselves today. Elder Devers shared with us that land acknowledgement, but we should also call out the fact that our indigenous brothers and sisters have had to deal with some significant situations since folks first came to this country. Stripped of land in some instances and moved to other locations, taken away from traditional foods, and the attempt to take away culture or to at least erode culture. And many nations and tribes have held on to the many of the traditional ways, but at the same time, there were many lives that were lost, and wealth was extracted from these communities as well, both in the natural and the spiritual world. And if we're going to have an honest conversation, then we have to call out the fact that African slaves were brought to this country to do some of the most dangerous work that others did not want to do, work that sometimes others did not have the skills to do. Once again, being taken away from their traditional ways and their traditional foods. And for those of you who work on food insecurity or food justice issues, you have to tie the work that you do in this moment also to what has been lost and what we are now remembering and trying to make sure that we're holding on to in the past. We also gotta give some attention also to our Asian and Pacific Islander brothers and sisters. Chinese Americans actually built the infrastructure in this country. When we talk about the railroads and what a critical role that they played for their time and even to today, then we know that, again, our Chinese brothers and sisters and others were given some very dangerous situations to work in. They were the frontline workers of their time. Just like African slaves were the front line, I don't know if I want to say workers, they was doing a lot of work, but they wasn't getting paid for it. So we have to understand how the past connects to our future. And we know that there have been a number of other groups who have come into our country, sometimes brought into our country, and the impacts that have happened to those people. Understanding there was a power dynamic that was going on all the time. And there's something else I want all of the students and students of history and students of the moment to also pay attention to, is the question of how policy was utilized for both these injustices in the past, the situations that we're going to talk about here today in the present, and then also how do we utilize policy and tool development to make sure that we are actually creating a brighter future, one that is inclusive, one that is honoring all the skills and abilities and innovation that everyone brings. And the reality of the situation is, as we take this journey together, is that we will not be able to win on climate change if we are not honoring those voices, that innovation, that ingenuity, that is going to be so critical, because it is literally going to take everyone for us to be able to deal with the climate crisis that we find ourselves in. The reality of the situation also is that we are dealing with a time in history, and you've heard it said, where science by an administration is not being honored. It's not being valued. And we also know that the rule of law has also been very challenging for some in this time. But we also need to understand that when we are looking at what's happening in this moment, again, of how we got here, when we look at sacrifice zones that are across our country, there was intentionality in the development and design of those. When we look at the people who, in many instances, are living in our sacrifice zones, communities of color, African Americans, Latinx brothers and sisters, indigenous brothers and sisters, lower wealth white communities, and sometimes there are some others who are there in that mix. Those are the folks who are living in these sacrifice zones that we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about also, how do we change that dynamic? When we look at some of these situations that are currently going on, we have to get to the root causes of what's happening. I know that we're not all in the same location today. There are folks from Hawaii, all across California and other parts of the states as well, but I want you to do something very quickly with me. I want you to take in a breath. Just take it in. And just hold it for a second. And now let it out. And the reason that I want you to do that is because sometimes we don't pay attention to that. I know it's becoming much more apparent why we need to be able to protect that. But for so many people, it's an autonomic response. It's something that we just do. We breathe in and out on a daily basis, and we forget about what we are actually taking into our body because we assume that it's going to be something that is actually going to be beneficial. In our country right now, we have 100,000 people who are dying prematurely from air pollution every year in our country. And disproportionately, it is African American and Latinx folks and indigenous brothers and sisters and lower wealth white communities who are having a very difficult time in being able to actually take that breath of fresh air. In our country right now, we got 24 million people who are suffering from asthma, 7 million children. And we know disproportionately it is African American and Latinx brothers and sisters, the ones who are going to the emergency room and the ones who are losing their lives before we found ourselves in this COVID-19 moment. There are communities across our country that in many instances are unseen and unheard by far too many. Even though their voices are gaining strength, we still have to call them out. In places like the 48217, for those of you who've ever been to Detroit, that zip code is the most polluted in the state of Michigan. And what you'll find there is that the children, when they wake up in the morning and when they look out the window, they don't get a chance to see what some folks have grown up with. They don't get a chance to see trees and green space. What they see is the piping that exists inside of these facilities that are there, that are literally pumping out tons and tons and tons of toxins that these kids have to deal with. Or you can go down to the Gulf Coast. You can go down to the Manchester community in Houston, Texas. The Manchester community is a hardworking Latinx community doing everything right. But yet they are dealing with, for as far as the eye can see, petrochemical facilities and other toxic emitting facilities. And the dynamic that goes on there, and some folks in Cali and some other locations will be able to understand this. When you're in this community, and if you reach out your arm while you're in the front yard of some folks, you can touch the piping that exists. No one should have to live in a situation like that. And if you go to people's backyard and you reach out your other arm, once again, you can literally touch the piping that exists in these facilities. And we have to ask the question, how did we get to this type of a situation? How do we have folks of color and lower wealth being pushed into certain areas? In certain parts of the country, it's restrictive covenants, it's redlining, and it's zoning. And the zoning in many instances, if we're talking about wealthier communities, they are zoned residential. But when we look at many of these communities of color that we find in these sacrifice zones, they're in light they're in light industrial or industrial. And we know what that ends up leading folks to. Or you can go to Port Arthur, Texas, further down the Gulf Coast, where you had a middle-class African-American community and once again became surrounded by all of these facilities and eroded all of the basic structures that were supposed to be in place that folks had for decades and decades. Or for those of you who have been studying environmental justice or the impacts of climate change, you probably have now paid attention to a place called Cancer Alley. The reality is that we have smaller cancer alleys around our country. There's one in Appalachia. I grew up in Appalachia in Michigan primarily, and maybe I'll talk a little bit about that, but in the cancer alley that's in Louisiana, between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, founded by, in many instances, by folks who were freed slaves, for as far as the eye can see. And people don't have 10 times the cancer rates. They don't have 100 times the cancer rates. In some instances, 1,000 times the national average on various cancers are going on. But you don't even have to leave the state of California. You all know about Exide and the things that have been going on for decades and decades and decades for that community, and the exposures there in South LA that everybody had to deal with and continue to deal with to today, and the dust that was coming off and impacting folks. And what are we talking about, Mustafa? Well, when we're talking about these exposures, we're talking about cancer clusters, we're talking about liver and kidney diseases, we're also talking about lung diseases. Why is lung disease important in this moment? You all know why. Because many folks who are living in these communities now have to deal with the chronic medical conditions of the exposures for sometimes decades upon decades upon decades. And now we have COVID-19. And COVID-19 feeds on chronic medical conditions. Please, if there is somebody in the media or anywhere else that tells you that that's not true, do your own research. And you will see from a number of studies that one, it makes you more vulnerable to the virus. You have higher hospitalization rates. You have higher infection rates, and you also have higher death rates. And once again, we know the communities that are being disproportionately impacted. So the chronic medical conditions is a part of it, but we also know communities of color are the ones who are dealing with this in a disproportionate way. And what we find with that is 4.5 times hospitalization rates for African Americans. We also know you're 2.5 times more likely to die from COVID if you're African American or Latinx. And the interesting thing for our indigenous brothers and sisters, and you all saw this in the early days of what was going on, and still to today, there on the public health side is room for improvement, is that they weren't capturing the data for racialized groups until there was an outcry and people began to push and push and push. And for many of our indigenous brothers and sisters who have been for decades, along with other communities of color, been pushing to have the right types of infrastructure in place, especially public health and medical infrastructure, there are many folks who are getting infected and just not getting captured in the systems, although I will say that there have been improvements. But you and I know that that's not good enough, because if one person slips through, if one piece of or one set of information is not being captured, you know, that's another life that is being put in danger, and we can't have that. And for those of you who spent time over in Wilmington, there in California, you've seen the multiple sets of facilities that are there, and you have got to have heard the stories of how folks have been impacted time and time and time again, and all the various public health challenges that people are facing. And let me say this, because we're having real talk today. For all those folks who worked in the environmental world, for all those folks who a little bit later on came and were focusing on climate, and you didn't focus on what folks were telling you was happening from frontline communities, then we all play a role in the moment that we find ourselves in. Because we should have been making sure that we were protecting those communities for decades. And now we find ourselves in this moment. And we know that the other thing, along with people getting sick and people dying in frontline communities, was also the fact that we now find out that, of course, the emissions that were making them sick are also the emissions that are warming up our oceans and our planet and our drivers in the climate crisis, along with the fact that we've got 2.4 million miles of pipeline in our country. Let me say that again for everybody. 2.4 million miles of pipeline in our country, and people continue to want to build more pipeline. So for all of you who are great with math, 2.4 million miles is enough to go to the moon and back, and on your way again to the moon. So I think we got enough pipeline. Of course, all of us are focused on a just transition, and we're also focused on, moving away from the utilization of fossil fuels. And we'll get into all that, because that's an even deeper conversation that we need to unpack here today. But I also want to ground for folks the places that we've mentioned, but also what we're dealing with in our country. And then I want to talk a little bit also about our vote and how we change some of these dynamics that are going on. So I want to sort of raise with you all the reality of what's going on in our country right now. We've got 140 million people who are poor or lower wealth. We got 80 million people who are uninsured or underinsured, right? We got 24 million people who are living in food deserts or food insecure areas. We got 25 million people who are living in physician deserts or medically underserved areas. I want you to think about that. Understanding those sets of dynamics that are going on. Understanding that we got over 7 million people who have been infected by COVID-19, that we've got over 200,000 people who have lost their lives. So let's go back and think about something. If we've got 23, 24 million people who are living in food insecure areas, should we have a strong focus on that so that we can help to strengthen people's body by making sure that they have healthy food and access to that food to be able to be a part of the process of keeping you strong, right? And if we know that we've got this type of a situation going on with COVID-19 and the impacts that I told you a little bit earlier, just on the air pollution side, and we've got 25 million folks who are living in physician deserts or medically underserved areas who need to, one, have access to a doctor or to a medical professional to, one, deal with the impacts that we know are happening both from pollution, that are happening from COVID-19, and then of course, we've also got the impacts that are happening from the climate crisis that we find ourselves in. And in California, y'all already know, California, Oregon, Washington, the wildfires. And we also know that from that pollution that's happening inside of communities of color that have warmed up our planet and that are playing a role in the droughts that are going on, right? And the increases in heat, that it also is creating more pollution. And all of the folks, whether you are close by where the fires are or dealing with the plumes that have found themselves moving clear across the other side of the country, that is also creating additional impacts, both in communities of color, but across our nation, and playing an additional role in the warming up of our planet. And imagine if we had just paid attention to what folks were telling you from the front lines about what they were experiencing and what they were dealing with. And some folks are not that focused on what's happening on the air pollution side. So we should also talk a little bit about water and why our vote is so critical, both in dealing with air pollution and water pollution and some of the other things that are going on. And we know that everybody began to pay attention to water quality issues as a nation when Flint happened. We know we got 1 million kids in our country who have been lead poisoned, and that can come from a number of different ways. But we also know that when you are poisoned by lead, that you're dealing with neurological disorders. You're dealing with hyperactivity, ADHD. There's a laundry list of different things that can come from that. And here's the thing that sometimes we don't pay enough attention to, and then think about how our vote plays into this, that there are over 1,000 locations across our country that have higher levels of lead in their water than Flint does. When you go to Detroit again, or you go to Newark, or in Washington, D.C. for a while, or in Baltimore, or I could name about another 40 different municipalities across the country, there are folks who don't trust the water quality that they're dealing with. So 1, there's an education there. 2, there's an analysis there. And 3, there's an affordability aspect there. In Detroit, people were literally losing their homes because they could not pay the water bill. Their bills continued to every year just to go up and double and triple. And then there were some folks who lost their children because it was considered an unsafe living condition if you don't have water. Our indigenous brothers and sisters have taught us for millennia, and maybe some folks have paid attention over the last few years, that water is life. Water is life in so many different ways. On a spiritual level, on a physical level, and actually your brain needs water to actually work on a mental level. But you also know, you've seen these situations in the Central Valley and a number of other locations that we can talk about, where folks are having a difficult time in being able to access clean, safe drinking water in our country. I want you to anchor this. in our country, there are over 2 million people who do not have access to water in rural locations primarily, but sometimes also in more inner city types of situations, but primarily on the rural side. And we've got to make sure that when we're talking about people and power and the climate, that we're figuring out how do we actually deal with that situation to make sure that their voices, their needs are being honored and real change is actually happening. And that comes back to your vote. So whether we're talking about air pollution issues or water pollution issues, or if we're talking about affordable housing issues, which is an environmental justice issue, and it is an issue tied to climate, then we have to be thinking about how do we change this dynamic to make sure that people have affordability and being able to live in a safe space. Also, how do we make sure that we're building wealth? Because wealth is tied to power. Now, wealth can be analyzed in lots of different ways, but we know in this country, one of the ways that people have garnered wealth has been passing down property or homes from one generation to the next. We also know, for those who are students of history, that there have been things done through policy to stop some folks from being able to actually own those homes. And we can unpack that in the question session if folks are interested in that. But we also have to understand, again, how our vote helps us to make sure that we don't make some of the mistakes from the past. Mistakes like putting affordable housing in flood zones, putting affordable housing next to facilities, and utilizing affordable housing in a number of different ways that cause problems. I just want to talk a little bit quickly because everybody in Cali and other cities understand transportation and how that has been a driver also with climate change, but I want to take it a step backwards. I want to talk about how policy and race has literally separated certain communities. It's broken up communities. It has actually taken wealth into some communities and dumped off pollution in others, and that was through policy decisions. And that's why it's so incredibly important to make sure that we understand the biases and the systemic racism of the past, to make sure that when we are talking about moving toward this new clean economy, that is actually going to be one that is beneficial to everyone, that it doesn't impact anyone. And there are great examples that are out there of how communities are actually making change happen. You can look at the work that is happening by Diane Takvoyen and the Environmental Health Coalition in San Diego, who are just doing incredible work and making sure that people have access to green space and addressing the housing disparities that are happening and making sure that things are being cleaned up and working with the ports, which we all know, if we can get it moving in the right direction, if we can make sure that we move away from the utilization of fossil fuels in that whole paradigm, that can have a huge positive impact on the lives of folks who are living close to what's going on in the ports, but also, the further out sets of opportunities by cleaning up our air and stop having all these impacts that are going on. And then you have folks like the good folks over on the Navajo Reservation and Nation who are doing all this incredible work with solar. And it's been going on, for a number of years now, training folks who live on the res to actually be able to install the various solar things, to maintain them, and to make sure that there's real economic opportunities that are going on. And again, ownership is a big part of that. Or you can go down to South Carolina, Spartanburg, South Carolina. For all the folks who are economic majors or something like that who are watching, I just want you to think about this, or if you're into management. If you could make a $20,000 investment and you can leverage it in $300 million in changes, would that be something that you would find positive? Well, there in South Carolina, the Regenesis Project was able to do that. They had all the dynamics that many of us see in the work that we do across the country. You know, they had bad transportation routes. They had something called shotgun housing. Some folks will know what shotgun housing is. You can open the front door, see out the back door, no insulation, those types of things going on. People in that community were paying $400 a month for their electricity costs. And these were many folks who were on fixed incomes, you know, lack of access to healthcare. Seniors had to travel half an hour to get to healthcare, food insecurity and food desert issues where no supermarket, you know, on the side of town where these folks live, and a number of other dynamics. Fast forward, now got 500 new green homes in the community, which has lowered people's electricity costs down to $67 a month and will eventually zero it out. You got 5 new healthcare centers and a mobile healthcare unit. Incredibly important because it's creating jobs, but it's also giving people access. And then they also made sure that they got new transportation routes, they got a new supermarket, and other businesses came in. And there were worker training programs, which is incredibly important because it was the local residents who were the ones who were making the change happen. The local residents were also the ones building their own businesses around this redevelopment that is happening. And when we talk about a new clean economy, that is a part of this paradigm of addressing climate change, but also helping people to have new sets of opportunities, then we need to be looking at models like this. And the other thing that they did, which was so important, along with cleaning up the brownfields and Superfund sites, is that they got people engaged in the civic process. They got people to vote. And then they were able to get people from their own community on the city council, in the county commission, and in the state house. Imagine where you come from. If you could get people to understand the power of their vote and how you don't have to wait for somebody else to represent you or your community. If you can't find someone who represents what you believe in, if you can't find someone who will protect you and your family, guess what? You have the ability to do that. And it can be on the local level, the county level, the state level, or even eventually on the federal level. You don't have to wait for somebody to come. You've got that ability inside of you, inside of your communities. Mrs. Ramirez, she may not have went to college, but she knows a whole lot about what's going on. And she would be fantastic. Let's get behind Mrs. Ramirez. Go ahead, Mrs. Ramirez. Or Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson worked 40 years in the plant. He knows everything that went on over there, but he also knows what was missing. Mr. Johnson needs to be on the city council. Or you just came out of undergrad and you're like, you know what? I have never liked how I've seen things going down. You can do it too. You can literally be that voice that can help people to understand some component that maybe they didn't. And you can literally help to make sure that your community is stronger and better and wiser. And it is about your vote. In this moment, I hope everybody filled out the census. I hope that everybody has gotten registered to vote, but that's just the first part. You got to get that ballot in, whether it is a mail-in ballot or you end up going to the polls, you got to do that, but it doesn't stop there. The next part of it is that you yourself have to make sure that all the folks that you have influence with, that everybody has influence. Sometimes you think you don't. I bet you there are more people who actually value what you have to say than you might realize. Make sure that all of them are following those steps also. And then once November the 3rd is over, that's when the work really begins. That's when you have to make sure that you're holding people accountable. I don't care if they're Democrat, Republican, or independent, you gotta hold them accountable because your vote can determine if we actually minimize and eventually eliminate this air pollution that is killing people. When folks say we can't breathe, that is real, right? Because there are so many people, whether we are talking about, and I'm just gonna keep it real, if we're talking about a policeman with their knee on your neck, you can't breathe. Or if we are talking about COVID-19 and how it constricts the lungs until you can't breathe. Or if we're talking about that pollution that comes out of those stacks that is asphyxiating people, you can't breathe. But your vote can change each and every one of those dynamics. And it's because if you realize that you have power, it changes the game. Everybody, wherever you are. There might be some folks in the room with you, or you might be by yourself. I want you to say power. I'm going to count you down. 1, 2, 3, power. Now, if you truly believe that you have power, then you will translate that into real change. It might take you a few times for it to get good to you because they don't teach us about power in school, right? Nobody taught us about Power 101 in elementary school or junior high school. When we got to high school, when a whole lot of power dynamics being taught, sometimes you get to college, you might have a professor who shares something with you about that. Or maybe in grad school, law school, medical school, whichever one you go to, you might get blessed and someone begins to teach you a little bit about that. In our country, we should be teaching folks about power, but how do you utilize power in a way that actually helps people and not power as a dynamic that extracts from others, but one that lifts everybody up. I'll leave y'all with this because I'm running a little bit long. Dr. King shared with us in one of the quotes that is not as famous, although it should be, as some of the other ones that people will often remember. Dr. King said, we come to these shores in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. I want you to think about that. In relationship to everything we're dealing with around pollution, in relationship to COVID-19, and in relationship to the climate crisis that we find ourselves in, we're all in the same boat now. Although some boats got holes in them. Some boats don't have any oars, right? So we don't ever want anybody to think that everybody's boat is equal, but literally we are all together. And if we realize that, and that the pie doesn't, it's not about a piece of pie as is sort of shared with us. That's crazy talk. What it is about how do we expand it? When we talk about a new clean, green climate economy, there is limitless sets of opportunities because for all the challenges, there's even a bigger set of opportunities if we reframe the way that we think and to reframe the way that we move forward. I'm Mustafa Santiago Ali. I want to thank y'all for a couple of minutes of your time, and I look forward to us unpacking some of these questions.
Thank you so much. That was super inspiring. Power. I love it. And now we're going to take a few questions. I'm going to start with one that came in through our registration, actually, because I think it is really interesting, and I loved your thoughts on it. Do you have any strategies for opening conversations about justice with folks that might be closed-minded? You know, what kind of language can we use to start talking about how to link these justice issues to environmental issues without maybe putting people on the defense?
Well, there's a couple of parts to that, right? So we're gonna have real conversations because we all know that we've got folks like that we deal with. So the first part of it is, and I had to learn this over the years, is that you only have so much energy. And you have to decide where you're going to invest that energy. And you also have to figure out, is it that someone just hasn't been exposed to information, or are they just not interested in information? And if the case is that, you know, they are open-minded, they're open-minded in the sense that they just haven't been exposed to certain things, then it is a conversation that takes time of sort of dropping those seeds and then coming back and watering them, if you will. So, you know, that's one part of the process. The other thing that you have to figure out is being able to meet people where they are. So, and finding out what is it that they find value in, and then making the linkages between what someone cares about. Example, there are some folks in the past, and probably still a few around, you know, who only saw the environment through a traditional conservation lens, right? And for them, it has always been about national parks. It's been about, you know, our icebergs, those types of things, important things. So if I'm having a conversation with someone and I know that that's what they care about, then I might begin by sharing some information with them to help them to know that 90% of our national parks are now dealing with significant air pollution issues because they care about that issue. And then Do you know where that pollution is coming from? That pollution is coming from those Black and brown communities over there. So if that's what you care about is the national parks and you want to be able to fix that, then we have to work together to also address what's happening in Black and brown and lower wealth white communities and in indigenous land, if you're serious about that. I say all that to say, you got to meet people sometimes where they are if they are interested in actually trying to evolve and grow. And again, I'm gonna take it back to where we started. You have to also do your own analysis. Is this person serious about really trying to better understand stuff? Or are they just, going through whatever emotions they're going through? And I never even say that we leave those folks behind. We have a serious set of issues that are going on. And that may mean that we have to come back around and pick them up after we get the work done that's necessary. Because if you listen to the IPCC report, the National Climate Assessment report, we know we got 7 years and a number of months left before we hit that tipping point. So you have to decide where you want to invest your energy with the time that you have.
Great, thank you so much. I wanted to share a question that we got in from Richard. He says, I'm a botanist in Los Angeles. And I think his question is about, what role do scientists play? What do you think scientists can do a better job to communicate about environmental issues? And then he also had a separate question about what can those of us in higher education do to better mentor students of color who want to get more involved with this, when so many of us that are involved with this work, come from a certain demographic, and we want to make sure to expand that to all communities, especially those most impacted.
Those are great questions. Some people must have been listening to some of my the podcasts lately. So let's start with the first one. So I sit on the board of the Union of Concerned Scientists. Scientists are critical, right? Because scientists, along with traditional environmental knowledge and some of the other bases where information comes from, are the ones who are anchoring us in the reality of what's going on and how we address, the challenges that are in front of us. I have a unique model that I utilize, and maybe it's from my time at the Hip Hop Caucus and a couple of other places, but I believe that we bring and have scientists and we have artists and entertainers and other creatives coming together, right? Creatives have the ability to reach millions and millions and millions of people, or sometimes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, but folks trust them because they come from where they come from. They look like the folks who they're engaging with. And my motto is we get people's attention with those brothers and sisters, and we also then anchor it with what science is going on. Many scientists, and I just had a conversation the other day with one of the top climate scientists in the world, and we were talking about the fact that many scientists maybe are not, someone who's going to stand up in front of a room of 5,000 people or 10,000 people or whatever it is, but they know their stuff, right? So we find a way to amplify that information and to have that expertise in our, not just our conversations, but in our strategies, right? So that's one part. Let me real quickly go to the next question or the other part of that question. For those of us who really understand the journey of science, then that means that you really got to reach people at a very early age and then work with them throughout so that they have those skills, those foundations that are necessary. You usually don't get to college and say you're a sophomore and say, you know what, I want to be a physicist. Now, I ain't never taken any math classes or science classes that are necessary, but I want to do it. There are those rare instances when somebody will be able to do that. We have to make the investments. And I have mentored and done all these different programs over the years with kids at an early age, all the way up through college. And it's so critically important for our professors and others who are already overworked, and I get it, but we are literally trying to make sure that we have the infrastructure of people to deal with all these situations that are coming. So that means for those who are not, and I know some are, that we've got to be making investments at the lower grades to help these students of color who are trying to get into STEM programs and STEAM programs. we've got to make sure that they have the skills that are necessary. And then sometimes we have to do some accelerated work for those students who maybe just didn't realize that, but that's not the best model. The best model is for the investments to be there. And I'm just talking about some of your time. I also understand the financial investments have to be there. And that means that our legislators and others and corporations and foundations have to also be increasing the investments so that when you come in, that those other resources that are necessary are there. Everything I do is from a comprehensive lens and understanding all these various pieces that are necessary for the whole. So those are just a couple of my quick ideas. And there are a couple of models that I've worked with on the question that was posed as well. So I can always try and get you some of that information too.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to jump to a question, sort of paraphrase from Josh Lopez. He includes a quote in his question, quote, "If voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal," which is a very thought-provoking quote I hadn't heard myself. But to paraphrase his question, voting has existed, a lot of things haven't changed. What would be your response to those who maybe feel like that isn't enough and maybe a little bit disempowered by that being offered as a solution?
No, that's fair. But I'll give you another quote. If voting didn't matter, they wouldn't try so hard to stop you from voting. So you have to ask the question, why are they doing everything possible to stop you from voting? All these voter ID laws that are unnecessary, the voter suppression that's been going on for folks of color for a long time now, and lower wealth white communities at one time as well. So the question is, why would someone, if it had no value, why would they be working so hard, investing so much money and stopping you and creating laws and hurdles and all these other types of things to stop you from voting? But I feel your pain. And I also feel where you're coming from, because there has not been as much change as we would like to see. Sometimes we need to forget, because we live in this moment that we're in, and we forget that African Americans, white women, indigenous brothers and sisters, Asian and Pacific Islander brothers and sisters were literally stopped, couldn't vote. And then when you can't vote, when you're not engaged in that process, somebody else starts to make a whole lot of decisions for you. They make decisions on where resources are going to go. They make decisions on how you are going to live, and a whole bunch of other things that come out of that. Now, here's what I propose. Once again, if you don't find anybody, you run for office yourself. Secondly, for the next 10 years, which literally, if you are now 18 or 20 or 22, you will blink. And I promise you, because I did it and I stopped blinking, you will be 30 years old before you know it. So over the next decade, and I can't even tell you how many young people I work with around the country. For the next decade, we're going to stay engaged in the civic process from the local level all the way down. I say start at the local level and work your way up the ticket, right? And what we're going to do is we are going to see if this democracy is actually going to work, because young people, 4 million new young people become 18 every year. Folks of color working hard to make sure that those who don't have the right to vote yet, we make sure that they do, and everybody else who does, we stay focused. And we're going to stay focused through 2 general elections and all these midterms. And then we're going to see if real change can actually happen. I know without a doubt that it will. There's a cultural shift that's happening in our country, and that's the reason people are trying to stop so many folks from voting, because they see Black and brown folks, but they also see white brothers and sisters standing in solidarity around a number of these issues. So the next decade gonna come, no matter what. So we're gonna make sure that we're in the game, and we're gonna push, and we're gonna pull, and we're gonna hold people accountable. We're gonna hold ourselves accountable, and we're gonna see if we can really make change happen. Here's the reality of the situation. After this next decade, if we haven't done what we needed to do, you're not gonna have to worry about a whole lot. Well, you're gonna have a whole lot to worry about, but because we're now gonna be deeper into the climate emergency, hopefully we can flip it from an emergency to a set of opportunities. And then let's circle back around. Hopefully I'll still be around in a decade. So why don't you make sure you get my information. We're going to stay in touch. And I actually want to go into some deeper conversations with you, because a lot of the artists and entertainers that, a bunch of us have worked with, some of them came from that mindset also. And then after we began to break down what's been going on, we understand why we need to vote more. If you look at the analysis of some of these areas where some of these police officers have been doing some of the most egregious behaviors, and then you look at the voting pattern and not understanding how your vote determines who's the district attorney, who are the judges, who are a number of these other people who are playing out, both on the impacts that are happening from, the police brutality, and flip it, also making decisions around where pollution is going, and flip it, also looking at where we don't find medically served areas and where we also don't see a new set of economic opportunities. All of that is tied to your vote. So I get it, but at the same time, we need to reclaim our power and not spot it. Let's get it right. We're gonna get a whole bunch of folks arm in arm saying, we're gonna make change happen. So I hope you'll be a part of it.
You know that we will. Just wanted to share, I don't know if you've had your eye on the chat because I know you've been talking, but we definitely have an endorsement for you for president in the future. So we know you'll be around in the next decade. Mustafa for president. I'm going to get to one more question. I think maybe we have time for just one more short one. And it comes from someone asking, what are some tools for pushing back against social injustice and environmental injustice when it's not seen as part of your job description and your work, and maybe kind of extending it to students, maybe of their field of study and their future career path? How would you recommend that they integrate that into the work that they do?
Well, one of the things that's great, I was really blessed when I was a student to be able to do this, is to actually, and folks want you and they need you, as long as you're coming, as a true ally, get together with frontline organizations. There are networks, there are local organizations, and just figure out, where you fit in. The beauty of all this work that we need to do underneath of social justice and environmental justice and climate justice is that everybody is needed. Everybody has incredible gifts and blessings. I mean, it's amazing that God gives everybody something, and some people get a whole bunch of something. You might be an incredible poet. You might be an incredible writer. You might be, a great app developer. You might be, someone who's studying the law or an economist, or all these different types of things. No matter what it is that you got, what you need to do is make sure you're giving it to somebody else in solidarity. You're coming together. So sometimes we forget how simple that is, but how incredibly important it is, and how that plays a significant role in making change happen. I'll share this with y'all. I've been blessed. I've worked in federal agencies. I've worked on Capitol Hill. I've advised White Houses. I've sat down with, Fortune 500 companies, all this kind of stuff. And the thing to get people's attention is when folks who don't normally come together start coming together and start having conversations. In this country and in other locations around the world, people separate folks on purpose because they know that when you actually start spending time together, your humanity increases. And you realize that you have a whole lot more in common with folks than you have difference. I don't care where you come from. And once that begins to happen, it changes everything. So that's why I say, if you're a student or if you're somebody who's looking, just link up with folks and then listen and then share. I'd love to do this. And folks will be like, you love to do that? Well, great, we need some of that. And the next thing you know is you got something magical happening. And other folks are then saying, well, how did they get that? Can I get some? And change happens. And then we just got to stay focused. There's a whole bunch of stuff that will try and take our focus away all the time. We are bombarded, sometimes with important stuff, but a whole bunch of foolishness. Know what you are supposed to do. and stay with it. And I guarantee you, I see it all the time, all over this country. Sometimes when I'm outside, change is happening. Folks just need more folks to keep feeding in and helping that to grow and grow and grow and grow. And once again, you will blink and you'll be like, whoa, how in the world did this happen? It took work, but change can and will happen. Women didn't think they would ever have the right to vote. People got focused. There's still a lot that needs to happen to make sure that women are truly being honored, but change happened. They told Black folks, one, you'd never be free, and two, you'd never be able to have the right to vote. Took a lot of folks coming together. Change has happened. They told folks you would never have environmental laws. If you look at the skies now from the wildfires, that's the way the skies used to look in the 60s and the 70s across our country. And people got together and they stayed focused. And yeah, there's a whole lot of work that needs to happen to get that stuff better and get it more protective of everyone. We need to stop letting people tell us that we can't do something, because we can. There are plenty of examples throughout history. And we haven't gotten it perfect, but together we can get there.
Well, it breaks my heart to have to stop you there, but we are at 1:01, and those are very inspiring words. What I'm hearing is we are all catalysts. We all have power. We need to use our voices to connect people across our communities and for change. So we do have a couple of closing announcements for those who want to stick around. But other than that, we want to thank you so much for your inspiring words and for sharing your message with all of us. And yes, to those who have asked, we will be sharing the recording. So I know some people had to jump on a little bit late. We encourage you to join us for our next event in this series to hear from an artist, to your point, a hip hop artist and climate activist, and another influencer who is doing amazing work as young people. We'll share those links in the chat. We'll put them in the post-event survey as well. And I do want to just do a quick plug for an event we're doing on October 20th, where we'll be bringing together Cory Booker from the US Senate and a former recent presidential candidate, and also our California Secretary of State, Alex Padilla, to be doing a Get Out the Vote event to get you ready and have a plan and get you excited about voting, and also talking about what happens beyond November 3rd. So with that, I thank you so much, and everyone have a great rest of your day. Power.
All right, everybody.
All right.